Hello, I'm Tess, founder of the blog The Trouble with Talking. Today I'm delighted to be introducing you to Bill Eddy, one of the world's leading high conflict specialists. Today I'm interviewing him about his book, So What's Your Proposal? Shifting High Conflict People from Blaming to Problem Solving in 30 Seconds. We join this interview as he introduces us to his definition of high conflict people. Enjoy.
Just one more housekeeping item before we get started, and especially for my clients, but for everybody really. It's important to approach situations with the thought a person may be a high conflict person. It is not about diagnosing someone. It is about finding techniques that work for you in a given situation. It's about how you respond. So please don't go back to your office and say, you know what, you're a high conflict person. I don't want to be hearing from your boss. So, on that note, Bill, as I mentioned before, I love the simplicity of how you express and explain things. And it's very easy to overcomplicate things. Your definition of high conflict people is a lovely, simple example. Can you please take us through the definition of high conflict people and the characteristics of high conflict people?
Sure. So high conflict people, basically, we call them the most difficult people because they tend to have a target of blame. They have someone that they focus on, and there's many people out there who are difficult, they're uncooperative, or they don't respond or do things. But the high conflict people are the ones that engage you with conflict. They draw you into the conflict and they don't like to let go. And so we think of them as the most difficult people, especially because of this target of blame. Now, in general, we think of 4 characteristics. And the first one is this preoccupation with blaming others. It's all your fault. It's not just a little bit. And of course, it's none of their responsibility. And this can be to anyone, and high conflict people can be in any position because it's not about the position, it's about the personality. And so you could have a low-level employee, you could have the owner of a business, you could have neighbors, you can have family members, etc. It also doesn't have to do with intelligence. There's basically 4 characteristics. So the first is this preoccupation with blaming others. The second is a lot of all or nothing thinking, and they typically see solutions as kind of my way or the highway. You know, since it's all your fault, you go fix it, I'm storming out of here, things like that. So it's all or nothing. And they tend to see people that way. People are all good or all bad. And if you're in a dispute, in a family, in a workplace situation, then there's people they like and people they don't like. And so they kind of that all or nothing thinking. The third is unmanaged emotions. Not all high conflict people demonstrate this, but many of them do. And this can be, they can just start yelling, they can jump up and walk out of a room during a meeting. Even I speak to judges who run courtrooms, and I say, how many have had someone storm out of a courtroom before their own hearing was over? And half the judges raise their hand because they've seen that happen. So those are high conflict people, can't manage their emotions. And then extreme behaviors. And extreme behaviors, we think about things from violence to, just spreading rumors, stealing from people, breaking things, just being super uncooperative, or trying to really harm someone's reputation, harm someone's finances. The whole range. I mean, some extremes of behavior, even killing people, tends to be high conflict people. They say about half of the prison population has antisocial personality disorder, and those are often high conflict people because they engage in behavior that harms other people. It's extreme, and some of them enjoy it. Although most high conflict people don't enjoy hurting others, they just kind of oblivious. They don't realize how they're affecting other people. Now, they're on a continuum, so not everybody is as extreme as everybody else. And you've got the slide there, the personality continuum. On the left are normal responses. Everyone gets upset sometimes, but it's situational. And most people have effective problem solving, so problems are always going to happen. But then you use this normal skills and you say, hey, there's a problem, can we talk about it? And the other person says, oh, okay. And you talk it through, maybe you get a little bit upset, but you don't damage the relationship. And you may be under stress, but again, you still can deal with the difficulties, even if you're under stress. You might say, I need to get back to you next week. I haven't had any sleep or something like that. High conflict personalities seem to be stuck in a pattern of high conflict behavior. So they're often rigid, they're not going to move at all, they don't look at themselves, they don't self-reflect, and they don't self-correct. In other words, if they engage in a negative behavior, they don't look at themselves, and so they don't change it, so they keep a pattern of negative behavior going. They have a hard time empathizing with other people because they're so absorbed with themselves and often their own distress. And I might add that they're not usually happy people. The behavior you see is because they're unhappy and they're trying to fix things and make them better. They just engage in behavior that harms themselves as much as other people sometimes. So they focus outward, they blame others, they get defensive, etc. And I wanted to mention in terms of behavior that fourth characteristic, extreme behaviors, are behaviors often that 90% of people would never do. And that's something I've been thinking about more, and I don't know if I've mentioned that before, Tess, but the idea that if someone does something that 90% of people would never do, it's often a sign that there's a high conflict pattern under the surface. So some people's behavior you can recognize pretty quickly as potentially high conflict person. Anyway, I wanted to fit that in.
And I think we've seen a few extreme behaviours in workplaces, and you just go, wow, that's so over the top. That's way over the top.
Right. It usually shocks people. People go, oh my goodness. Either they didn't expect it from that person, or they didn't expect it from anybody in a staff meeting or in an open office or something like that. So we're seeing people caught by surprise by those extremes of behavior. Now, people often say, oh, he was tired, or he was under a lot of stress. 90% of people, even when they're tired, even when they're under a lot of stress, aren't going to be running around breaking things, hitting people, sending emails that say that they hate their job, stuff like that. I mean, things that happen. Usually the average person under stress when they're tired may be more irritable, but they're not going to be acting in these high conflict extreme behaviors. Anyway, with that said, some people with high conflict personalities have personality disorders, and that's been studied a lot. And there's 5 in particular that seem to be present in a lot of high conflict disputes: narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, antisocial, and paranoid. And that's not the focus of today's discussion, but it is good to know that there's a lot that's understood and there's patterns that can be recognized. And as Tess said, if you recognize these patterns in somebody, don't tell them. I recently was consulting with some people who confronted someone. Three of them confronted one person, and they wanted, it was a family member, and they wanted the person to go get some help. But instead what happened is that person refused to get help, turned to other people against the three of them, and then they called me and said, whoa, what do we do now? And so I gave them some suggestions. But it just doesn't work to confront people with a personality problem. It's better to work on how you're going to respond, and that's where we're going to get into today's discussion.
And at the time, they don't see that they're being extreme. They think it's perfectly reasonable in the situation that they're in. They don't get it as extreme at all.
Right, right. They think it's necessary and normal.
Yes.
And they may have grown up with that kind of behavior being normal or even necessary to protect themselves. But then they go into the rest of the world and it just doesn't work.
So you talk about, Bill, that there needs to be a big shift that happens, and I agree with you 100%, because we need to shift these potential high conflict people into a space where we can actually start to communicate with them. They're so fixated and their thinking is very narrow. When I first read about the big shift in your book, I was looking at it and I'm going, there's no way. And what happened is I actually had someone in mind that I was working with a client, and I was like, there is no way that this person is going to do that shift. And I was looking at the technique and I'm going, oh. But what I found was when I tried it, it worked, and it opened up their thinking to new possibilities. It broadened their thinking. I spent the rest of the day wandering around with a silly grin on my face and with a good dose of disbelief. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the big shift, and in particular the science that goes on behind it. And I found this powerful when I was reading it, because it then helped me understand what I needed to do with that client. So over to you, Bill.
Okay. Well, the brain science seems to be, from the authors that I read and the seminars I've attended, seems to relate a lot to the difference between the right and left hemisphere approaches to conflict resolution. Generally, the right hemisphere is where you've got your defensive, protective emotions, and so people are taking things more extremely. So when we talk about all or nothing thinking, unmanaged emotions, extreme behaviors, they're often driven by right brain protectiveness. It's like the person truly feels they're in a life or death situation, even though they're not. And so they're reacting with that intensity, and that's often what people see. And they go, wow, you know, that person's so irrational right now. And that's exactly what's happening. The left hemisphere seems to be where we have more problem-solving connections and skills, more chance to be refined in looking at several solutions, in looking at what's worked in the past, how to plan for the future. In many ways, the right brain is focused on the present, especially when it's defensive, and so it's not thinking about the effect of yelling and screaming right now. It's just person feels just taken over by emotion. But the left brain goes, well, I have choices here. Let's look at some other alternatives. How can we solve this problem? How can we analyze things? And so the big shift is trying to move someone from those upset kind of right brain emotions to left brain problem solving. And the key to, so what's your proposal, is getting them to think rather than to react. And so that's the big shift. And the easiest way to do that big shift is to ask them one simple question. So, what do you propose? And I'll tell you this, I learned everything the hard way, I should tell you, over all the years. I basically made mistakes, and then I studied what should I have done. And so I learned this in my mediation practice, but I found that it helped me in my law practice. It helps me with consulting and coaching with people. And basically, I would argue with people. They'd say, well, she never did this, and he always did that. And I would say, well, don't talk about the past, or don't blame the other person. Stop doing that. And that didn't go well. Then they get irritated with me, and they'd say, you've taken her side, or you've taken his side. And so I was kind of like, how do I get them to stop doing what they're doing without them hating me for it, and feeling like I've taken sides? And then I realized, if I just ask, well, what do you want to do now? What do you propose? What do you suggest? Then people had this momentary, like their head would kind of just twitch a moment, and then you could almost see them thinking and instead of reacting. And I started learning to say, I don't know if he never did that or he always did that, but what do you propose going forward? What do you suggest would make this work in the future? What would it look like for you? And people stopped being defensive. And so I got better and better at just skipping over criticizing anything. They'd be going on about the other person. I'd say, so what do you propose? And I didn't even tell them to stop doing what they were doing. It just distracted them. And I started, like I said, seeing people's face, their head moving, just a split little motion, like they had just shifted sides of the brain. And now they were thinking of solutions and no longer having to be defensive, because frankly, we haven't messed up the future yet. We've only messed up the past. So if we don't talk about the past, we don't have to defend anything.
You talk about in the book, when you start to learn this technique, to actually start using it with yourself. You say, ask yourself that question. Can you take us through that?
Yeah, because actually that's the easiest place to start. So before you start reacting, is to say, so what do I propose? What do you propose, Bill? And then I would start picturing, what did I want to get them towards? What was, how can we move? Maybe we need to change the subject. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to propose that we change the subject. And then, so I've asked myself, what do you propose? So let me give you an example. I was doing a mediation, and like I said, I learned this in mediation, but I can use it with individual clients, and you can use this with large groups as well. But I was in a mediation, and the couple, it was a divorce mediation, and we were planning for 2 hours, and when they came in, they said, Bill, today we have to make this such and such decision because one of us is leaving town tomorrow. And I was like, oh, okay. Then an hour and a half into it, we were nowhere near making a decision about that, and I was starting to feel stressed. And I felt myself kind of pressuring them, which I don't usually do. That's not my style. And then I realized I feel responsible for this decision. So it's like, wait a minute, Bill, why are you upset? You're feeling responsible. What do you propose? What could be done? And I go, oh, I need to tell them they've got some options and see which one they want. So I said, hey folks, we've got half an hour left, and it doesn't look like you've made that decision yet. So you've got some options. You could we could extend the time. I can go another half hour. We could forget about making a decision on that today, or we could schedule another time to I forget, or you could just quickly make a decision right now. So I said, what do you folks suggest, or what do you folks propose? What do you want to do? So I pictured them having these 3 options and giving it to them. So in a sense, I made 3 proposals, but by asking myself, what do I want for them? I want them to decide this. I was able to calm down and focus. And I think in general, that's the thing of asking yourself, what do you propose before you try to control anybody else is, what do I propose? What do I do now? And that's what I decided in that case, and it worked. And they said, oh, we're not going to resolve it today, so we'll just have to come back to that issue later.
So Bill, what are some of the typical responses you get? You talk about like the tilt of the head, and you talk about the them starting to think. Are there typical sentences you get, typical reactions you get from that?
Well, the first reaction, of course, is you have to train people in this, and you can do it on the spot, and it's very quickly. And they may go, what do you mean, what do I propose? It's your problem, you should solve it, or something like that. And I'll say, no, actually, I think you probably understand this problem better than I do, and you're a big part of solving it. So think about it. What would you suggest? You seem to have some solutions in mind. And so you kind of keep putting it back on them, and then they start going, oh, okay, and then they'll say, my proposal is, and you can feel them kind of struggling to not just react. And then they say what they propose. So the first is some resistance, and that's fine. Just kind of teach them about it. Say, this might feel awkward at first, but if you just put a proposal out there, just say who does what, where, and when, then I can think about that. And because I want to know what you think, and you're a key part of solving this problem. So yeah, so I would say you get some resistance, but also once they've learned about this, then there's like, oh, what do I propose? And then, like I said, you kind of see them shifting, and then they come up with something. So that's my experience, but people should know it doesn't happen always easily, quickly. You have to kind of keep them focused.
So you talk about in the book that training them becomes you're training them to do 3 steps. Can you take us through that 3-step process? It's beyond just what is your proposal.
Right. So if you're really working in a decision-making setting, so let's say you're at a staff meeting and you want to, and you're leading the meeting, then you want people to understand this process so that they take it seriously rather than just reacting to people. Or you can do this, between 2 people, or just do it with 1 person with you. So what you do, the first is ask them to make a proposal. And proposals basically contain who does what, where, and when. And so, this is what I want you to do, this is what I'll do, I propose that's what we do. So that's one approach, but that's the first step. The second step is, and this is where it's tricky with high conflict people, because let's say you have 2 high conflict people and you're playing a leadership role, is you want to say, now go slow here. You made your proposal. Now I want the other person to ask some questions about it. And so think of, some questions like, what would my part be in it? Or when would this begin? Or how would it work if we added another person into the problem? Or where can we get some more information? So asking questions, having them answered, and that process, just right there, gives them a feeling of respect rather than disrespect or reaction. So just by managing that step right there, not letting them respond too quickly, letting them ask questions rather than say, no, I'll never do that. Then after they've asked their questions, the third step is to respond with yes, no, or I'll think about it. And this is real important because the I'll think about it gives them time to kind of emotionally calm down, kind of get more into the left hemisphere. Maybe even to go do some research, talk to somebody else, talk to someone who might be involved, but an outsider. So it buys time. But also they could say yes, and then if you're in a leadership role, you might write down and ask details. If they say no, you say, that's fine. But if they say no, then guess who has to make the next proposal? The person who said no. So that's part of how this works best. Because I have people, and I do training in this. And actually, I'll mention right now that I teach a course in Melbourne each year at Monash University Law Chambers. And so I have all the law students practicing this technique in groups of 3. And they'll say, well, they said no right away. And then they said, make another proposal. I don't like that proposal. And I'll say, you have to make the person who said no make the next proposal. Otherwise, they just sit back, cross their arms, and undermine the process. Say, no, that's not good. Try another. No, that's not good. Try another. And so what this does is it makes both people have to invest in left brain problem solving. At least that's what I think is going on. And I see this work all the time. As Tess said, she was a skeptic at first, and I stumbled into this, but it really is amazing because you get people thinking, but you have to keep them narrowly focused. They can't react and go off on a tangent. You have to say, wait a minute, is that a yes, a no, or I'll think about it? And if they think about it, you want to find out, when do you think you'll have an answer? Do you need an hour, a day, a couple minutes, a couple months? But this simple structure seems to work, especially with high conflict people, because when they have a lot of structure is when they do their best. So that's basically the essence of the 3-step, so what's your proposal technique in decision making. Right there, and it's amazingly simple. It's just enforcing it. That's the hard part.
And for me, there's 2 things that were really surprising for me as I started to work with this with some of my clients is when you get the people to start to ask and answer questions, both parties start to learn more about the situation. And so in a very recent example, 2 clients were talking about how to improve processes in preparation for a new system implementation. And there's 2 sides. The line was in the sand, and we're doing it this way, we're doing it that way. And what happened with the asking and answering questions is they learnt more information, and a lot of information was put on the table that one party was not aware of. And so you may not be aware of, but one of our clients needs this type of reporting, and which lends itself to blah, blah, blah. And with that new information, actually made it much easier to look at an optimum outcome and stopped the defensiveness from one party in particular. And the other thing that I really like about it is I'll think about it, stops people being put on the spot. And I think if they have to make a decision on the spot, you'll often get a no, and it's a very inflexible no. I've said no, and that's it. Whereas if you teach them that they don't have to make a decision and they can think about it, you have more flexibility. And even if you're in a short meeting, you can say, well, let's just think about it and we'll come back to it in 15 minutes or something like that. It doesn't need to be a long time frame away to get back to it. And those 2 points became really, really powerful in interactions for me with some of my clients.
Yeah, it's very important, I think, to realize what you're saying, which is this doesn't have to take long at all. Even a 10-minute break sometimes gives people enough, relieves the pressure, so they don't have to be in their defensive brain.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and people like being part of the solution rather than told what to do. And I would suggest that a lot of the defensiveness of people nowadays, especially high conflict people, is when they're difficult, people start trying to tell them what to do. And rather than having them calm down, they become more difficult because they're not feeling respected, listened to, etc. So this gives a structure that lets them be listened to without being out of control or too emotional and outraged. Because with structure, they can participate. People like this technique, and I've seen people use it and just go, wow, you know, they get the credit. You know, it's not me, they get the credit because they're the one who came up with the proposal.
And I love the simplicity of it as a practitioner. I love the fact that it's only a 3-step process and you're not having to remember a whole pile of things. And it flows. It's just so easy to flow with.
Yeah. Now, I was thinking of, I could give a short workplace example.
That would be great.
Yeah, and I'm pulling this from the book, the So What's Your Proposal book. And so here's an example of a team that's under pressure. And Jessica is the new manager. Let me see if that's right. Let's see. This is brainstorming at work. And one of the interesting things about brainstorming is that there's a lot of research out there that actually people do better brainstorming individually and then putting it together rather than just everyone arguing at a meeting for brainstorming or brainstorming in front of each other because they discourage continued thinking. And so by getting everyone to think. So let me give an example. So Jessica's in her 30s, just became one of the youngest department heads in her company. One of her older employees, Sam, had also applied for her job. She was concerned about how to establish herself and her role. So she had a meeting with Sam, just getting established. So let's see. Yeah, here we go. So Jessica just starts by meeting with Sam. Then I'll have her meet with the group. Sam, you're one of the first team members I wanted to meet with since you have the most experience in this department. I'm very interested in your perspective. I want you to know that I welcome everyone's proposals for how to deal with any problems that arise. Actually, I'm asking everyone to tell me 1 or 2 proposals or options for solving any problem they bring to my attention. Now tell me how you came to work here and what you think will be some of your biggest challenges this next quarter. So Sam says, well, getting product A out on the market is going to be a huge problem. We've been working on it for 3 years. I've been personally working on it from day one. I'm the only one still here who has this much experience on it. So he's trying to kind of, boost himself. And she says, that's great. You'll be a major team resource. But before we talk about product A, I'd really like to hear what attracted you to the company, etc. So they get acquainted, but she's already teaching him that she wants proposals. So that's going to be not only a way that they solve problems, but a way that she manages him, because she's giving him a way to be important that doesn't challenge her role. So now, let's see. I want to get to, so she's got a team meeting. So what she says here is, so they're going to have a meeting about product A. And so Jessica says, product A is behind schedule and we've planned release date in 3 months. I'd like to get your best ideas and proposals for what we should do. Who wants to go first? And she had asked them to prepare proposals before the meeting. Sam says we should put it out. Regardless of how perfect it is, it's a decent product. We can improve it after it's out. Time is of the essence because of our competitors. Tony says it's not even decent yet. We'll embarrass ourselves if we get it out prematurely. We still have miles to go making it do everything we promised. Sure, it's functional now, but it's not up to our usual standards. Releasing it like this could hurt our credibility. Sam, how can you say it's not even decent yet? I've been working on this for 3 years, and it's sure as hell satisfactory. Jessica says, I prefer we not debate any specific proposals or exact words at this point. Let's just keep coming up with proposals for what to do. What do you think, Carly? Carly says, I think we should delay the release date until it's fully functioning, blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't be proud of it, but in today's tech world, people lose interest fast. Sam, that's absurd. You all know, blah, blah, blah. Jessica says, oh, he says, if we extend the deadline, people will get lazy. Jessica, is that your proposal, Sam, that we rush ahead during the next 3 months, release it, whatever shape it's in? He says, actually, I have another proposal. And that's what she asked for, is everyone to come with at least 2 proposals to the meeting. And that's one of the ways to manage a group, like a work group, so that, or anybody in problem solving. So if the first proposal doesn't go anywhere, they're thinking of the next instead of fighting for their first proposal. So then Sam says, he talks actually about releasing things. He talks about Steve Jobs releasing products before they were finished being made. And he said, let's see, he demonstrated each of these products on the day he announced them so he could show off their best qualities without mentioning the capacities that weren't finished yet. Since no one had it in their own hands, they couldn't know that it wasn't really functional yet, and they didn't have time to try to imitate it, but they really wanted to see it. Jessica, that's a great proposal, Sam. Something to really think about. Anything else, Fred? Fred says, I like it. I like Sam's proposal. I think it's the only compromise that might work. Anyway, they go on, and she ends with, great proposal. I'm glad you looked for more than one proposal for today, and everyone else did too. So that just gives you one kind of workplace example, but hopefully you can see it helps people come up with ideas because it gives them a structure, but it also helps manage a group with a potentially high conflict person. So anyway, that's just one example.
I love the example from the point of view that it's about managing the whole team's expectations as well, and that it becomes part of a norm in the culture.
Exactly, because the norm isn't to fight for your idea. The norm is that everyone needs to come with proposals, and if a proposal is rejected, it's not the person, it's the proposal that's rejected, and then you've got another proposal. So it keeps everybody looking at proposals rather than looking at each other.
People often come into those situations looking at what they consider as the best option forward or the best path forward from their worldview, and when you're able to get people to put proposals on the table, you're opening the thinking to consideration of what ends up being a more optimum view with taking into consideration all the things that are tabled.
Right, right. And one of the biggest issues is this shift from people fighting and defending to brainstorming and creating.
Yes.
And it's interesting. I remember reading an article a couple of years ago about there was some lawsuits and Apple was involved in some lawsuits, and there's a newspaper reporter was saying, well, Apple focused more on fighting rather than creating. And I thought to myself, that's an interesting concept, that a lot of today's businesses can get stuck in fighting rather than creating. And that was before the iPhone 6 came out. And I think what happened is Apple settled their lawsuits and focused on creating. And so that's really what's your proposal is about, is like, let's get past the fight and create the future.
Yes. I'm going to ask everybody if they've got any questions, just reminding you, you can use the question box. And we're going to move on to talk about some tips and recommendations when making proposals. Bill, there's the two things there's three things here we talk about avoiding, and the first two are fairly obvious. However, the third one, the why questions, can you take us through why we should avoid the why questions?
Why questions tend to plunge back into the past and into what people think about each other. And it may look innocent, and sometimes why questions are okay, but my experience is most of the time when someone makes a proposal and the other person says, why did you make that proposal? What they're saying is, that's a stupid proposal. They don't want to know why. What they're trying to say is, that's no good. Or why did you think I would ever agree to that? Or why didn't you make that proposal a year ago and we could have saved $50,000?
Mm.
So what seems to happen is why pushes people backwards into the past, and the reasons that brought it up, they'll say, why? Well, because you never did it the other way. So when I teach people this method, and I'm teaching them to use it with each other, I tell them, let's avoid why questions, whether it's a mediation or a staff meeting, etc. What we want to do is look at the what, the who, the when, and the where, so that it's forward focused. It's because what's interesting, high conflict people have a pattern of arguing with proposals. So that's why this structure is so important, and why the hardest thing about the structure is getting them to ask questions rather than reacting.
And the what, the who, and the when, and the where is the construct of the proposal.
Yeah, it really gets you into the details, and once people are into details, I think they're in their left brain's problem solving.
Yes.
And that keeps the shift going. And that's why the asking questions keeps it there. So they're both looking at it as a problem to solve rather than attack and defend. And if they can't resolve it themselves, is give them at least 3 alternatives, if you know. So you're leading a staff meeting or you're mediating a dispute, is say, well, here's 3 suggestions, here's 3 ideas. What do you think of those? Do those help you look for some solution? By the way, you can do this with an individual. Let's say you're coaching an individual and you're saying, so what are you going to propose when you go back to work? And they might say, I have no idea. And so you could say, well, why don't I tell you what 3 other people have done?
Mm.
And so then they can go, oh, well, I like one of those. Let me give you an example with this. I gave you a workplace example. So now let me give you a divorce example where 2 parents are arguing over developing a parenting plan. And this is one I had as a mediator. So mother makes a proposal, and father says, oh no, that's a terrible idea. And so I said, well, what do you propose? And so he said, well, what do you propose to me? And I said, well, I'm the mediator. I don't make proposals. That's your job. But what I'll do is I'll tell you what some other couples have done. So I said there was parent A, couple A did this approach, couple B did that approach, couple C did this other approach. And when I said this, the wife says, well, Bill, couple B did what I proposed. That's what I was proposing. And I wanted to go, shh, don't say anything. But it was too late. She'd already said that. But it was okay because the father responded and said, no, it's not, and I like it. Let's do Bill's proposal B. And so I said, well, it's not my proposal. I'm just telling you what other people have done. But if you want to use that as your proposal, how would you describe it? What would the who, what, where, and when be in your situation? So he says, well, I would. And so he kind of took ownership of doing something like couple B. And then I asked her if she had any questions about it, and she said, no, you know I'm going to agree to this. And then she says, I agree, yes. So, you know, just sometimes giving them three alternatives, they just don't think outside of the box.
Yes.
And so if you have more knowledge, this is a way to share your knowledge without telling them what to do. Say, here's some alternatives, and give it back to them to make the proposal.
That was a great example, Bill. We've got
Yeah.
we've got 10 minutes left, and we've got a couple of questions. So,
Oh, great.
yeah. One of the questions: shouldn't we just let the person talk about their upset feelings to get it off their chest?
Well, the problem is with high conflict people, they don't get it off their chest. So what we want to do is kind of focus them and distract them from their upset emotions. And that's what I find really seems to work with high conflict people. Because they don't go through the normal grieving and healing process. The average person might come up to you and say, you know, you're a friend of mine. Can I just tell you what happened and get it off my chest? And you say, fine, and they get it off their chest. And they feel better. They say, thanks so much for listening. And all it took was 3 minutes of listening. With high conflict people, they say their stories over and over and over again. And so if you just listen, you haven't shifted them. You haven't done anything to help them solve their own problems. So that's the reason why that doesn't work, and why this works is because it distracts them from their upset emotions, and then they feel better once they're focused in their left brain on problem solving, because they're no longer defensive.
Which leads into the next question. Why can't I defend?
Well, the problem again is if you defend yourself, first of all, you're disagreeing with their point of view, and it's usually about the past. We defend the past, and so you're keeping them stuck in their right brain defensiveness because now you're an adversary. And you might think you're explaining what happened, but over and over again, even when I thought I was gently, pleasantly explaining things, if you talk about your past behavior and why you did something, it'll feed the conflict with a high conflict person. It's just so hard for them to look backwards without getting defensive themselves. So that really, it just doesn't work. And frankly, if people aren't sure, I say go ahead and try it. But if it doesn't work, then say, well, what do you propose? What do you suggest?
And make that shift happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And what if the proposal does not go anywhere?
Okay, there's several suggestions for that, and I'm not going to be able to cover them all real quickly, but they are in the book. And what I want to suggest, first of all, is the idea of saying, well, here's the 3 alternatives that some other people have done. Does any of that help? Also, teaching them how to resolve disputes. Like you might want to make a proposal that somewhat splits the difference between what each of you are saying. Because a lot of people are just stuck in their position and they can't see that there's a gray area in the middle where they might be able to resolve things. And frankly, I teach people in negotiations that the majority of settlements of financial deals happen somewhere in the middle between the first 2 offers. So think about something in the middle that might be a compromise you could work with. Another is, what if you did it one person's way now and then the other person's way later? Like some things that have a course of time, or payment plan. So someone's paying off a debt. I want you to pay this. I want you to pay that. Well, why don't we compromise with a payment plan that starts out big and then gets smaller, or starts out small and then gets bigger? So you're kind of opening up their thinking to problem solving rather than helping them defend their position. And that's part of where the difficulty with this method is keeping them focused on problem solving, solutions, not defending.
And I think sometimes too, and you explain this really well in the book with some of your examples, is that people might put a proposal on the table, but it's a very, very big proposal and it's got and this and this and this, and breaking it down. And there might be a part of the proposal that someone really disagrees with and they can shut down the entire proposal because of it. But you talk through in the book, breaking it down to what they do agree on and then working with the parts that they still need to make more proposals about.
Right, right. And the other thing actually I wanted to add too is often if they're stuck, I encourage them to do some research.
Yes.
And talk to some people or do some reading, see what other people have done. And that keeps it in the context of it's just a problem to solve rather than deciding who's right and who's wrong. So it really keeps that left brain problem solving going.
Well, we are just about out of time, Bill, and I would like to thank you so much for giving up your time, and to all the people who have joined us online. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be a part of this. We have some details where you can buy the books from either online or ebooks or hard copy locations. I probably should put in more than just Australia in there for hard copy. But also to a reminder that Bill is going to be back in beautiful Australia on the 5th and 6th of September in Melbourne, where he's running a new workshop. And do you want to talk very briefly to that workshop again?
Yeah, I'm going to do a workplace workshop. It's based on our book, It's All Your Fault at Work. I've been, for the last several years, teaching a law school class at Monash in Melbourne at the law chambers. And so this year, on the 5th and 6th of September, I'll be teaching this 2-day workplace course, which is good for managers, administrators, employees, mediators, coaches, etc. I actually have coaching credit for people that may be part of the International Coach Federation for the 2 days. Human resource people certainly like this. I did it last year. I think I had 19 or 20 people, and I'm excited about doing that again on those 2 days. I also do a 3-day law school class. It's intensive. It's 8 hours a day, so it's 24 total hours for those 3 days. And I've often had lawyers attend who are practicing, as well as students in the law school. And then I'm actually this year, for the first time, going to devote a day on the 2nd of September for judges. So if you know any judges who are interested in dealing with the increasingly high conflict litigants in their courtroom, I've got a lot of tips and suggestions for them. So that'll be coming up in September, and that's at Monash University Law Chambers. That's the Center for Judicial Innovation, and probably the best thing is, if someone's curious about that, is to look at my website or even just send me an email. I'm happy to respond to that.
And I can highly recommend Bill's workshops. I've attended 4 of them now over the last few years, and I cannot recommend them enough. So once again, we are almost out of time. I want to thank you all for taking your time out of your busy day, and thank you very, very much, Bill, for sharing your insights, your amazing insights and simple techniques.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I so appreciate you, Tess, supporting this kind of work and sharing your own experiences applying it, because you do such a broad range in the workplace, and I think people really benefit from your focus on communication, which fits so well with what high conflict people need. The way you communicate makes all the world of difference.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. Well, everybody have a good day, afternoon or evening, whatever's left of it, depending where you are in the world. And until next time, and we've got another conference coming up in about 6 weeks' time. We're organising it now. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.